Thank you, everyone. Good evening.
911, what's your emergency?
We have a trainer down. The orca has her. Please send help immediately.
The crowd's cheer broke like glass. One moment, children clapped as the surface shimmered under Florida's sun. The next, the pool erupted. A black and white shadow burst upward with terrifying speed jaws snapping shut on a figure everyone thought was safe. Gasps turned into a wave of silence, the kind that makes time feel frozen. Water churned, then bloomed red, staining the pristine stage into something unrecognizable. Parents shielded their children's eyes, but it was too late. The image had already burned itself into memory. In the span of seconds, joy had curdled into dread. This wasn't just spectacle gone wrong. It was a fracture in the illusion that humans could choreograph wildness, that applause and whistles were stronger than instincts honed across millions of years. Behind the screaming and the sirens, a harsher truth waited. This was no accident. It was a debt coming due, a system finally cracking under the weight of denial. For one trainer, the price was everything. For the world watching, the question had just begun to take shape. Because if the warnings had been there all along, ignored, dismissed, buried beneath the roar of profit, then, and if this was inevitable, how many more warnings have we already ignored? That question would haunt every witness, every official, every family that left the park that day. The show had ended, but the reckoning had only just begun. Before the headlines, before the horror that would etch itself into history, there was only a young girl staring through the glass of a massive tank in Chicago. She was 9 years old, nose pressed against the window, eyes wide at the sight of orcas gliding like shadows with wings. That afternoon, as her family tugged at her sleeve, she whispered the decision that would guide her life one day. I'll be in there with them. From then on, every choice bent toward that promise. While others drifted between interests, she charted a straight course, college classes and psychology nights, spent studying marine behavior mornings, running before sunrise to build the endurance she knew she would need. By the time she joined SeaWorld Orlando in the mid-90s, her reputation grew quickly, not for commanding animals, but for connecting with them. Trainers talked about the way she moved, never abrupt, never domineering, every hand signal an invitation rather than an order. Visitors noticed too the long braid pulled neatly back, the calm smile that never cracked, even when a 12,000-pound shadow loomed inches away. She became the face of the park, the poster on billboards, the reason children begged their parents to visit. Yet beneath the applause, her devotion carried a sharper edge. That bond she believed in so fiercely would be tested in ways she never imagined. Colleagues began to whisper that her closeness with the animals wasn't just talent, it was a kind of faith, a conviction that no matter how restless or unpredictable trust would hold. She believed the pool was a sanctuary, not a battlefield. What no one said out loud, at least not then, was the truth that hung like humidity in the air. Love, no matter how pure, was never going to be enough. And when trust is tested against instinct, which one survives, he was impossible to ignore. 22 feet of muscle, 12,000 pounds of dark power gliding beneath the surface like a living submarine. To tourists, he was a marvel, an icon they could point at with awe. To trainers, he was a paradox, majestic informer, but carrying a history that spoke louder than any performance. He had been ripped from the cold waters of Iceland as a calf torn from his mother, shuffled between parks as if he were a piece of equipment. Each transfer carved scars no one could see, yet they surfaced in other ways: nervous pacing, sudden outbursts, long stretches where he floated motionless, staring into nothing. The file on him was thick, filled with incidents others preferred to forget. Not one but two human lives already tied to his name, both written off as anomalies, accidents, or simply the cost of doing business. But inside the community of trainers, whispers spread. They knew his gaze lasted too long, too steady, like he was studying rather than responding. Some called it patience, others called it calculation. What no one dared to say on the record was that he was different, and difference in a predator, that size carried consequences. And still, he was kept in the rotation. Too valuable as a breeding male, too central to the show's spectacle, too profitable to sideline. SeaWorld gave him a nickname, Tilly Soft, almost endearing, as though shortening his name could blunt the truth of what he was. Yet every trainer who stood poolside with him knew the weight behind that curtain of calm. He was a storm behind glass. And the question wasn't if the silence would break, but when. The signs were there, scattered like storm clouds that everyone chose to call passing shadows. He began drifting for hours at a time, his massive frame logging on the surface as if sleepwalking through captivity. Meals that once sparked eager leaps became half-hearted fish swallowed and spit back over and over as though the act itself had lost meaning. Trainers tried louder whistles, bigger hand gestures, extra food rewards, but the spark was gone. It wasn't rebellion, it was retreat, a mind pulling back into itself. And then came the stares. Long, unblinking, unsettling. He would fix his gaze not on the crowd, not on the plastic props tossed into the pool, but on her. The trainer who trusted him most, who smiled at him as though he were family. Witnesses noted it wasn't aggression in the usual sense. It was something quieter, colder. A measuring, a waiting. Experienced handlers recognized the look, but kept their warnings muted. Too many notes had already been filed, too many concerns brushed aside by supervisors under pressure to keep the shows flawless. Maintenance logs told another story, scrapes on the tank walls where he had rammed the concrete as if testing the limits of his cage. Night staff whispered about restless thrashing, but their reports were folded into binders no guest would ever see. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to connect the dots, a giant under strain, a predator unraveling. Yet the machine of entertainment demanded continuity, and continuity demanded denial. The pool kept filling the bleachers, kept buzzing, and beneath the glitter of performance, something dangerous was winding tighter with every ignored warning. The afternoon sun bounced off the glass as families settled in for what was billed as an intimate encounter, a softer show, the kind meant to bring people closer to the animals. Children leaned forward on the railings, cotton candy melting between their fingers, while parents lifted cameras to catch every practice smile. At the water's edge, she stood as she always did, calm, confident, radiating a quiet assurance that everything was under control. The orca circled beneath, a black silhouette drifting like a shadow stitched into the pool surface. For a moment, it looked routine. Then the water broke. With explosive force, the whale surged upward. Witnesses later argued what he seized, but it no longer mattered. It didn't matter. Once his jaws locked, the stage transformed from theater to chaos. Gasps shattered into screams. Whistles cut the air as trainers rushed to deploy nets, alarms, anything that might break the grip of 12,000 pounds of fury. Nothing worked. He dragged her under in a violent spiral, the surface collapsing into white foam tinged with red. Parents pulled children close, some shielding eyes, others frozen. In the control booth, supervisors barked orders, but every command dissolved into helpless static. This was no choreographed breach, no rehearsed trick. It was raw instinct unleashed. Seconds stretched into eternities as the crowd realized the truth. The bond that had seemed unshakable had fractured in an instant. And as the water stilled, a single question hung over the terrified silence. If the safest hands in the park couldn't survive, what chance did anyone else ever have? The panic in the stadium did not fade with the sirens. By nightfall, television crews had already descended on Orlando floodlights, washing the park's gates in harsh white. The headlines wrote themselves, "Trainer killed by killer whale." That phrase looped endlessly across news tickers, repeating like a heartbeat that refused to calm. Within hours, the spectacle that had once been SeaWorld's pride turned into a crime scene in the public imagination. Families who had fled the stadium now sat in living rooms across America, replaying the horror on shaky phone footage, voices trembling in the background. The illusion was gone, replaced by a single image of power turned deadly. Inside SeaWorld's offices, the response was swift but sterile. A press release framed the event as a tragic accident, the unpredictable behavior of a wild animal. Words chosen not to reveal, but to contain. Absent from the statement were any mentions of the whale's history, no reference to the other deaths, no acknowledgement of trainers' ignored warnings. The message was clear: control the narrative before the narrative controls you. Yet outside those walls, the story had already escaped, spreading faster than the company could manage. Regulators moved quickly. OSHA investigators pored over years of safety logs, maintenance records, and internal memos. What they uncovered was not a single lapse, but a pattern. Red flags, buried reports softened, language massaged until danger looked like routine. Trainers called in for testimony described an unspoken culture, one that prized flawless shows over frank honesty, applause over caution. A trainer's life weighed against the revenue of a single holiday weekend. The fine that followed $75,000 seemed almost insulting in scale. For the public, the anger deepened. What else had been hidden? If the park could downplay deaths and dress risk as entertainment, what truth remained submerged? The pool, once a symbol of magic, had become evidence of negligence. And as parents looked into their children's eyes, replaying the moment, joy twisted into horror, one thought persisted. If the system had failed her, how many others were still in danger? The silence that followed didn't last. Within months, the tragedy became more than a headline, it became a rallying cry. Former trainers stepped forward, voices shaking but resolute, recounting years of ignored warnings and near misses swept under the rug. Their testimonies painted a different picture from SeaWorld's glossy brochures, whales gnashing against concrete trainers, quietly injured during rehearsals memos urging staff to minimize concern in official reports. These weren't isolated mishaps. They were a pattern hiding in plain sight. And then came the film. Blackfish, released in 2013, threaded raw footage, whistleblower accounts, and scientific insight into a narrative no marketing campaign could erase. Viewers saw not just a single incident, but the emotional toll of captivity, the way intelligence curdled into aggression, the way isolation echoed through every pool. It reframed the Orlando death not as freak accident, but as the inevitable climax of years of corporate denial. Suddenly, living rooms across America buzzed with debate. Teachers showed it in classrooms. Parents asked hard questions their children had never voiced before. Do these animals belong in tanks at all? SeaWorld tried to mount defenses, issuing counterstatements, funding PR tours, insisting the whales were healthy, happy, safe. But the tide had turned. Protesters lined the gates with handmade signs, sponsors withdrew partnerships, and ticket sales faltered. What had once been the company's crown jewel was now its greatest liability. Yet one question loomed larger than boycotts or fines. If the truth had been known for decades, why had it taken a single death broadcast to the world for people to finally listen? That unanswered tension hung heavy, a reminder that denial can last only until the evidence is too loud to ignore. As the protests swelled outside the park, grief took on a quieter form within the walls of a family home. Her parents, siblings, and friends found themselves at the center of a storm they had never sought, answering reporters' questions while navigating the kind of loss words can't hold. Yet amid the mourning, they refused to let her story collapse into tragedy alone. The Dawn Brancheau Foundation was born a promise in her name to protect what she had loved most: marine life education and compassion for communities in need. Instead of issuing blame, they chose to build hope, channeling sorrow into action. The foundation funded conservation programs, sponsored school visits, and supported sanctuaries. Children who once dreamed of touching a killer whale now learned about oceans as living, breathing systems, not stages for entertainment. In classrooms, her name was no longer tied only to the accident, but to a mission, one that insisted the best way to honor her was to ensure no one else paid the same price. At vigils, trainers and guests gathered with candles flickering in the night, speaking not of spectacle, but of spirit. They remembered the warmth of her smile, the way she treated every creature as a partner, not a prop. Each memory became a thread in a tapestry larger than loss, weaving together grief and determination. But even in these moments of healing, a deeper tension remained. Could community action and family resolve ever rival the weight of $1 billion industry? Or would their efforts, no matter how heartfelt, be drowned out by the roar of commerce? The answer was not yet clear, but one thing was, her name would no longer fade quietly into the background. 7 years later, the circle closed. In January of 2017, the orca, whose name had become synonymous with both spectacle and tragedy, was found lifeless in his tank. Official reports listed a bacterial infection, but to many it felt like inevitability. Decades of confinement had drained something essential long before his body gave way. The news rippled through headlines, reigniting arguments that had simmered since the day of the trainer's death. For some, his passing brought relief and end to the risk he represented. For others, it underscored the cruelty of a life measured not in tides and migrations, but in schedules and enclosures. The company marked his death with careful words, calling him beloved, calling him family. Yet no phrasing could untangle the contradictions. He had been both prized asset and unpredictable liability, both symbol of wonder and warning of hubris. His absence left behind more than an empty tank. It left a mirror held up to society, forcing a confrontation with the cost of domination disguised as entertainment. And so the question shifted. With the orca gone, what remained was not just grief, but responsibility. If the end of his life could not undo the harm, what lessons would outlive him? Families who once bought tickets now weighed the memory of a show against the memory of blood in the water. Children who once pointed in awe began to ask harder questions their parents could not easily answer. The tank was quiet now, but quiet is not the same as closure. Because the true reckoning was never about one whale or one trainer, it was about us. And as his massive shadow disappeared from the surface forever, another shadow stretched across the future. Where do we go from here? And what will it take to ensure no pool ever holds a secret this devastating again? In the years that followed, change began to stir not in sweeping gestures, but in steady shifts. Sanctuaries once dismissed as fantasy moved from blueprint to shoreline reality, offering whales a halfway home between captivity and the wild. Schools rewrote lesson plans, teaching not tricks and tail slaps, but ecosystems and empathy. Families who once planned vacations around theme park shows chose instead to watch pods breach in open seas where no whistle dictated the rhythm. Each choice, small as it seemed, chipped away at the system that had claimed so much. Legislation, too, gathered momentum. States introduced bans on breeding programs, lawmakers pressed for stronger protections, and the tide of public opinion continued to rise. The illusion of harmony behind glass had cracked, and through the fracture, a new vision took root, one of respect rather than control. Activists reminded audiences that progress was fragile, that without vigilance, the cycle could repeat, but also that awareness had grown too loud to be silenced again. Her name lingered through it all, carried not only by family, but by strangers who refused to forget. Every time her story was told, it became less about tragedy and more about responsibility. Less about what ended in that pool and more about what could begin outside it. The orca's death had closed one chapter. Her legacy demanded the next be written differently. Now the choice extends to all of us. Do we stand as spectators of suffering or as stewards of change? Every ticket not bought, every voice raised, every child taught compassion instead of spectacle is a tribute greater than flowers or statues. The past cannot be rewritten, but the future is unwritten still, and it waits for the courage to choose differently. Dawn's story is more than a tragedy. It's a reminder that silence has a cost and change begins with choice. If her legacy moved, you share this video so her name is never forgotten. Leave us your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe these animals should ever be kept in captivity? And if you want to join us in telling stories that protect life, consider subscribing. Every view, every voice, every choice helps push the tide a little further toward change.